everyone. My name is Amanda Wallmeyer, and I am the local history librarian here at Johnson County Library. Thank you for attending today's program, The Past is Prologue, Iconic Restaurants of Kansas City. The Past is Prologue is a bi-monthly program offered by Johnson County Library where we highlight topics that are often left out, glossed over, or misrepresented in our history books. We would also like to begin today with a brief land acknowledgement. Our Kansas City area institutions stand on the homelands of Native American peoples who lived at the juncture of the Missouri and Kansas rivers. In recent years, these nations have included the Delaware, Kansas, Missouri, Oto, Osage, and Shawnee. We pay respects to all Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, for their continuing presence in this land and the land where you may be joining us from tonight. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrea Broomfield.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad that you're taking some time out tonight to attend this Past is Prologue series, and I'm going to be talking about forging a culinary tradition, generation to generation, flavor to flavor. I've recently finished writing Iconic Restaurants of Kansas City, and that joins with a previous book that I've written called Kansas City, a Food Biography. And so this lecture tonight is based on the research primarily of that second book, but I'll be referencing Kansas City, a Food Biography as well. I'd sure like to thank Amanda, the local history librarian at Johnson County Public Library, for the organization, for inviting me to come and talk, and to her colleague Helen, who works as a reference librarian at Johnson County Public Library. The both of them have put together a week's worth of activities for me, including a lecture tomorrow night as well as a workshop on Saturday. So I hope to actually see some of you in person at one or two of those events later in the week. So let's go ahead and get started. I think that what I want to talk about tonight is particularly germane to this theme of Past is Prologue. That's because of the books, the restaurants that I feature in Iconic Restaurants of Kansas City were establishing flavors and dishes that remain popular in Kansas City today. Sometimes they're virtually unchanged. Sometimes there's an evolution involved. And so virtually unchanged, for example, might be Dixon's chili, if you've ever had Dixon's chili. Out in independent restaurants, we've seen some fascinating evolutions with them. Although some of the very early dishes that were featured at a restaurant I'm going to be talking about here later remain on the menu. The restaurants that I include were typically multi-generational, and/or they trained an apprentice or apprentices who carry on a tradition instead of allowing it to fade. And so as a result, we have this incredible continuation. You would see that, for example, at a place like Jasper's Italian Restaurant or Cascone's Italian Restaurant. The questions that my books and research explore include this: why should our restaurant heritage matter so much in Kansas City? And what is the value of understanding flavors, techniques, and recipes that were here in the past? How does a city go from just having a reputation for good food to having a reputation for cuisine, and has Kansas City achieved this? And more importantly for tonight, how can restaurateurs, chefs, bartenders, pitmasters, cooks, and patrons more consciously consider how our distinctive past informs our present and future eateries? As far as I'm concerned, the past is our prologue to our culinary future here in Kansas City, and the more conscious we are of creating a cuisine and preserving a heritage, the more our city's reputation for cuisine continues to rise. It continues to bring in tourists, tourist dollars, as well as the people who live in the city itself. So I'm going to go through my book chapter by chapter, focusing on specific restaurants tonight, but understand that if you check this book out from the library, each chapter has roughly 7 to 12 restaurants, the vast majority of which have closed. The last chapter is devoted to some of the long-standing restaurants that are still with us. So you're looking here at one of the Edwards Holslag murals that hung on the wall of the Savoy Grill Room. And I think that Holslag was integral to capturing a Kansas City that existed prior to the city's official naming. So let's go back to the days of the Santa Fe Trail and look at the foundations of Kansas City's culinary heritage. We're going to start with the Independence Hotel and laying a foundation, a culinary foundation. So prior to the settling of Westport, which is really where our Kansas City begins, there was Independence, and it was the terminus for the Santa Fe Trail. And as such, it was a thriving boom town back in the day. But it was really difficult in Independence to find a clean place to stay. It was filthy with dirt and mud and horse manure and pigs running through the street and just lots of carousing, etc. So if you wanted a place that was going to be a haven in the midst of all of that dirt and all that noise, you might have sought out the Independence Hotel. When we talk about a culinary foundation, it's important to understand that Kansas City area was part of Missouri territory that was brought into the Union as a slave state, which means that the vast majority of people who were settling here were coming from the South because their soil was all depleted. And when they came here, if they had slaves, they were bringing them. And so important to the Independence Hotel was Emily Fisher, who was born around 1808 and died in 1898. And she was enslaved, but then freed by her father, Adam Fisher, who wanted to make sure that she had a successful livelihood. And so he gave over to her the running of the Independence Hotel as a freed person from roughly 1855 to 1865. Well, we don't know much about Emily Fisher's food, except to say that because she was the granddaughter, or because Vieta Gar was her granddaughter and she was the cook for the Trumans, we have sort of a lineage that we probably can trace back to Emily Fisher. When the Trumans went to the White House, they took Vieta Gar along with them, not to become the executive chef for the Trumans, but rather to cook the home meals in the Missouri way that the Trumans preferred. And we have lots of details about what the Trumans loved, including things like Missouri cured ham, lots of greens that were flavored with bacon fat or bacon grease along with vegetables. Lots of biscuits were on the table, as well as corn muffins. The Trumans' favorite pie was a Kentucky classic called transparent pie that was this incredibly decadent mix of two kinds of sugar, white and brown sugar, that was then cooked on the stove with eggs and cream and butter, and then it was baked, and bourbon was commonly added to it as well for a flavor. So I think it's important to bring Independence into this story because it predated Westport, which really becomes the beginning of our Kansas City heritage. And so in Westport, we had the Harris House, and this was the fanciest place that you could stay when you were coming through Westport. It overtakes Independence as the terminus of the Santa Fe Trail. It is situated 1 mile from what was called Indian Territory, where Native Americans had been forcibly settled and who relied on Westport as a place to spend their annuities on provisions. So Westport becomes a boom town. It overtakes Independence in its population and its popularity. And the Jack Harris family from Kentucky moved to Westport, and they are the ones who start this particular house, or what was also called a hotel back in the day. And again, this place would have been serving people fancy food, at least fancy for the time. And this was also a place where people could stay. As often is the case, enslaved persons, if they're ever noted at all, often are noted because they were amazing cooks and providers of food. And such is the case with Minerva and her husband, Mark. They ran the kitchen and the dining room for the Harrises at the Harris House. And we have mention of them made by Carrie Westlake Whitney back in 1908 in a very early history of Kansas City. And you can see here in what Carrie Westlake Whitney says, the same kinds of foods are being mentioned that we would talk about with Vieta Gar and Emily Fisher. She says, Minerva and her husband Mark were renowned for their cooking. Minerva made cornbread, beaten biscuits, pies, and cakes, while Mark presided over the meat, roasting and carving venison, wild turkey, cured hams, and roast pigs with a flourish and a distinction that made him famous. So these foods that you're seeing here, of course, a lot of these would have been the result of a lot of game that was prevalent in this area, but you also see a lot of food traditions that are coming here from the South, including the importance of being able to cure hams to protect them from going bad in the hot weather. And then again, cornbread. Now, beaten biscuits, we don't eat those as much anymore. This was a crazy method of lightening biscuits by actually pounding them, pounding that dough with a rolling pin before you bake them. But I think I can say that most people like biscuits, and this city certainly loves pies and cakes. Well, eventually, the Santa Fe Trail and wagon trains in general fall out, and they're replaced by the railroad. And because Kansas City built the first bridge to span the Missouri River, its early reputation as a provisioning hub and crossroads was enhanced by this kind of industrialization. By the 1870s, Kansas City eateries were oftentimes associated with hotels, as well as the rail stations where thousands were passing through. And then airplane travel largely replaced rail. But as with rail, Kansas City had a very early and healthy development of the airline industry, because back in the day, planes that were going across the continent could not travel at night because there wasn't lighting. And so the planes would land here and people would spend the night, and then the planes would take off the next day. And even after we have jet planes, they still can't make it entirely across the United States. And so they're stopping here to refuel. So chapter 3 of my book, chapter 2 of my book, covers restaurants that were successful at catering to people who were passing through, but they also are spoiling Kansas Cityans because there's so many different choices and so many different price points and so many different kinds of food for them to partake in. You're looking there at a photograph of one of the most famous of the Harvey restaurants in Union Station, the Westport Room, around 1950, and you can see the Harvey girls there in their starched white aprons. And standing all the way at the back, you see the silhouette of Kansas City's most famous maitre d', Joe Maciel. Well, most of you probably are familiar with the Savoy Hotel and Grill that was in operation from 1894 to 2014 there at 9th and Central. We've got Harry S. Truman's favorite booth in one of the pictures, and then you'll see the grill entrance of the Savoy Grill in 1989. This place is often remembered by older Kansas Cityans as the restaurant where they first had lobster. Initially, though, the Savoy Hotel was catering to people who were coming into the Union Station that was actually in the West Bottoms. It was called the Union Depot. And this was a place that was popular with businessmen who were coming into Kansas City. The actual grill didn't open initially with the hotel in 1888 when it was still called the Thorn Hotel. It was a later addition, and one that was initially famous for its featuring wild game. Again, really celebrating the fact that the area was replete with venison and all kinds of fowl and all kinds of animals that tasted good if they were grilled. But eventually the restaurant became famous for its seafood as well. Its decline probably was dated to the advent of the desktop computer, of all things. I was interviewing Jack Holland, who had been a waiter at the Savoy Grill when he was putting himself through college. And he told me that the Savoy Grill was the place where you had all of these people coming for the famous 3 martini lunches. So lots of business deals were closed at the Savoy Grill, but the desktop computer took away our enthusiasm for spending time away from our desks. And suddenly we see this transformation of people just eating while they work. The 3 martini lunch definitely falls out. Business at lunch really fell off, and the Savoy was struggling. It was ended in 2014 by a serious fire that closed it down for some time. thankfully, 21st century hotels came in and bought the building, and they have refurbished the Savoy Grill, but it is a much different restaurant than it used to be back in the day of Harry S. Truman. Now, if you were African American, you weren't able during most of the early part of the 20th century up to into the 1950s to go into these restaurants unless you were working there. So I think it's important that we take a look at what was happening with African American dining in the heart of what we now call the 18th and Vine Historic District. There was the Street Hotel that was in operation from 1919 to around 1953. And this was the creme de la creme in the African American community. It was owned by Reuben and Ellis Street. And they started in Kansas City not as hoteliers, but actually as cooks with a street cafe that was very successful. And so, with financial help, they expanded to open the Street Hotel when the funeral home directors Theron B. and John Watkins gave them financial aid to do so. You see there Reuben standing outside of the entrance of the Street Hotel, and at night that sign was beautifully illuminated with neon in pink, and it was quite swanky. Some of you probably know the Blue Room. This was the very famous jazz club, home of the Benny Moten Orchestra. An incubator of that kind of hard swing that we call Kansas City jazz. And the bar was presided over by Jesse Kingfish, and he was considered to be Kansas City's, I would say, arguably its first most famous mixologist. But you also had the Rose Room, and this was considered an incredibly elegant restaurant. It was popular for entertaining among the elite African Americans in Kansas City, and it was also a fabulous place where one could get a Kansas City strip or a lobster. It was presided over by John R. Ross Jr. as the executive chef. And I'm going to go ahead and quote from Buck O'Neill, who wrote about the Rose Hotel in his book, I Was Right on Time. And he said this: "Imagine what it would be like staying in a fine New York City hotel like the Waldorf Astoria, nodding hello to Frank Sinatra or Doris Day or Fred Astaire as you pass by their tables." Well, the closure of the Rose Room, the Blue Room, and the Street Hotel was really the result of the end of segregation. To quote again from Buck O'Neill, he says that not only did a Black business die, other Black businesses did too, the ones that were dependent on Black baseball and Black entertainment. The Street Hotel had to close because it couldn't compete with the Mulebach downtown. But I think that it's just important to understand that there were many aspects of fine dining that were available to people throughout this city, even in the worst of the Jim Crow era. And the Rose Room and the Blue Room both exemplify the elegance and the style that we had here in Kansas City in the African American community. Well, planes and trains, they helped to cement our eating habits and our culinary identity in Kansas City, but cars arguably played the largest role in doing so. And so I turn in my book to the history of a number of wayside tea rooms and tea houses, as well as drive-ins that specialized in foods that remain today very popular in Kansas City, especially fried chicken, fried catfish, the humble cheeseburger with an order of onion rings and a shake. And you're looking here at some photographs of the line cooks at Smack's. And I would say that Smack's at one time was Kansas City's favorite local fast food restaurant. It was arguably the prototype of fast food chains that swept into the metro by the 1970s. A lot of people remember Stevenson's Apple Farm restaurant. It was in business from 1946 all the way up until 2007 and was situated at 40 Highway and Lee Summit Road. This was the brainchild of twin brothers, Lloyd and Leslie, and they returned to their family farm off Highway 40 after World War II, and they were trying to figure out a way to make a living. The Stevenson family had long had a farm stand that dated back into the 1800s, And so, playing off the fact that people were already going there for produce and apples, they decided to start a small luncheonette specializing in smoked meat sandwiches and apple cider. Well, it took off and it became very popular. So, what the brothers did is they decided to expand, and then they would expand some more and a little bit more. And the next thing you know, they have a sprawling restaurant with 8 distinctive dining rooms, including the pictures that you can see here of the backyard. Where you could eat outside as well as the cupboard room. I liked a quotation that comes from Chef Jasper Marabla, who owns Jasper's, a memory that I think a lot of people who are older, like me, share, and it's this. I remember walking into the parlor, the first room to the left of the lobby, or in a little faux balcony. I remember the paintings on the wall, the white tablecloths, starched napkins, candles on each table, and the big glasses. And, if you were an adult, it's likely that that big glass was filled with a very popular drink that was called an apple daiquiri. I'd also like to spend some time discussing the famous Compton Farm that was initially the home to Sandy's Oak Ridge Manor and Tea House from the 1950s until around 1980, and how it then became the location that many of you recognize now as Stroud's North. So Sandy's Oak Ridge Manor started with Louise and Darwin Sandstrom, and they purchased the estate from Emma Compton, who was the last surviving member of the Dr. James and Mary Ann Compton family. When they bought it, it had no electricity and no running water, but Louise in particular really wanted to continue the Comptons' reputation for hospitality by opening a restaurant that would include family-style dinners, particularly German specialties that come from her background, like Rouladen or Schnitzel, but also with that proverbial fried chicken, which takes us all the way back to the Harris House and Emily Fisher in Independence Hotel. So when Louise was ready to retire, Darwin having passed away some years earlier, it was at the same time that brothers Mike and Dennis Donegan, along with Jim Hogan, had recently saved Helen Stroud's original roadhouse that you're looking at there at 1015 East 85th Street. And they knew that they needed another location for Stroud's because the little roadhouse was just so phenomenally popular. And so they went ahead and they bought Sandy's and they turned it into what we today call Stroud's North. Sadly, the roadhouse was ultimately raised to widen the road there, and then it was down to Stroud's North, which continues to go very smoothly. There are also some locations of Stroud's out here in Johnson County once it became franchised. But as far as I'm concerned, I grew up very close to Sandy's Oak Ridge Manor, and I think that location is by far my favorite for fried chicken. Well, Kansas City, Kansas has its own distinctive restaurant history. It's one that differs from Kansas City, Missouri, in part because of those liquor laws that made it so difficult for the majority of restaurants on the Kansas side to serve alcohol up until the mid-1980s. And some of you probably remember the arcane and complicated system of club cards. We often think of steakhouses as a fine dining experience, but if you could not subsidize that expensive food with alcohol, it was difficult to survive. Well, LaFoon's Frontier Steakhouse from 1960 to 2020 is an example of one in Kansas City, Kansas that did. It specialized in 5 different kinds of steaks with a couple of different steak specials each night. It was a real icon of Kansas City, Kansas, a place that really operated as a gathering for various clubs like the Kiwanis Club, as well as a great place for wedding rehearsal dinners. And just a good time out. Sadly, it closed in 2020, largely the result of COVID and also just the aging of the family. Let's go ahead and stay on the Kansas City, Kansas side and talk about one little place called H&M Barbecue at 1715 North 13th Street. This was owned by the amazing Grace Harris, and she was a woman who came with her family to Kansas City, Kansas from New Orleans. She was a New Orleans native. She learned how to barbecue on the Missouri side with Otis Barbecue, Otis Boyd, who owned who owned Boyd and Son Barbecue at 5510 Prospect. So she learned the craft of smoking barbecue and making sauce from him. And then she opened her own little place, H&M Barbecue. This was a juke joint that not many people knew about unless they were in the know. But she would serve up New Orleans specials like jambalaya alongside barbecue and all kinds of sauces. More people would remember her as being the most important cook at the Grand Emporium, which was opened by Roger Neighbor in 1985 at 3832 Main on the Kansas City, Missouri side. And this was a place that was very popular for blues and roots music, as well as for Grace Harris's barbecue. The way that she summed up her cooking career was this way. She said, "Blues and barbecue, it's a love thing. I love to give these musicians this barbecue because it's what they love, and they love to give me this blues because that's what I love." So it indicates the synergy that we have in Kansas City and have long had between the importance of music and barbecue. Well, we can't not talk about the Golden Ox, and you're looking there at a picture of the stockyards that were so vital to the economy of Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas. And then you're looking at the Livestock Exchange building where Jay Dillingham housed his steak restaurant. He decided that instead of situating downtown where most of the steak restaurants were at the time, he would want to have a place that would cater to the ranchmen, the cattlemen, the people who were coming in to sell their cattle. You can see there in this 1950s postcard that the chairs are designed so that gentlemen can rest their cowboy hats under the chair while they're dining. This is also an important place when it comes to establishing the Kansas City strip steak. And you're looking here at a quotation that comes from Representative Victor L. Infuso, who's speaking on the floor of Congress in 1962 when Dillingham decided to open a Golden Ox in Washington, D.C. on L Street. And he says this is recorded in the congressional record. "It was in these stockyards in Kansas City that the now familiar Kansas City sirloin steak originated, something that even we New Yorkers prefer." So I think that kind of indicates for Kansas Cityans that it's not a New York strip, it's a Kansas City strip. The restaurant eventually closed, and it was a tragedy for many Kansas Cityans. And luckily, in 2018, Chef Wes Gartner and Jill Myers renovated a portion of the original building, and they reopened it. And they keep some of the heritage of the original Golden Ox alive for us today. Well, steak might be assumed to be an upscale food, and of course, it was often on the menu at fancy restaurants. But fancy restaurants shared their menu with many other types of food. So I turn in my book to upscale dining in Kansas City, and I make the case that it was difficult to maintain very high-end restaurants because we are a middle-sized city in the middle of the United States, and our citizens have historically been geared towards more approachable foods. In other words, good food, well-seasoned. But in terms of the upscale dining restaurants that made it, they often appealed to Kansas Cityans' values, and they did not merely ape the fashions and the fads of the East Coast or of European restaurants. So let's look at one of my favorites, and that's Breton's. It was located at 1215 Baltimore in the middle of, at the time, what was called Hotel Row. And it was owned and operated by Max and Mary Breton, who had moved to Kansas City because Max initially was here to direct the Jewish Community Center and the Jewish Welfare Foundation. But Max Breton must have been an amazing extrovert. He loved people, and he convinced his wife that he was in the wrong game. And he said to her, "A restaurant is nothing more than a community center with food, so why not go ahead and open a restaurant instead of running the Jewish Community Center?" And she agreed. Well, Breton's was famous for all kinds of continental specialties, like you can see there on the little menu. Roast duck was very popular, roast capon. Not on this particular menu, but often talked about was the chicken Kiev, the Hungarian goulash, and of course the Kansas City steaks were there as well. But many people will remember Breton's because of the Bali High Room This was opened in 1954 in the basement, and it was one of Kansas City's earliest tiki bars and Polynesian restaurants. It was famous for its cocktails, including one that was called the Atomic Bomb, and you were limited to just two. My father told me that the challenge after you had your two atomic bombs was, could you walk up the basement stairs to the outside without help? And the answer was typically no. Fedora Cafe and Bar represents how much change happens with fine dining in Kansas City from the days of Breton up through 2003 when it closed. A lot of you probably remember Gilbert Robinson. And that was the team that created so many of the very popular restaurants, particularly on the plaza. Fedora was its upscale concept. And Paul Robinson of the Gilbert Robinson said that Fedora was aimed at patrons who had evolved from the 70s single scene that was catered to by the nearby Houlihan's old place. You're looking here at some daily fresh sheets, care of Chef Jesse Vega, who was a young chef at Fedora at the apex of its career. And it's kind of difficult to read this, but you can see that the Monday, October the 28th menu featured a fresh trout with asparagus cream, and it was garnished with fresh white asparagus. There was also the mesquite grilled beef tenderloin wrapped in bacon with a Maui onion cream and green pepper sauce. And Fedora always specialized as well in a house-made daily pasta special. In this case, we had spinach and tomato linguine. So what was important about it was that the chefs were controlling the kitchen at Fedora, not corporate. And based on what came in on any given day, the chefs then created these fabulous menus. However, I would say that a lot of these foods that we see on this daily fresh sheet are still recognizable to Kansas Cityans. Many of us would gladly order trout with asparagus cream, or a mesquite grilled beef tenderloin, or a house-made spinach and tomato linguine. So we're not that far removed from foods that were highly popular in the 1980s, 1990s, up till its close in 2003. What made Fedora so fantastic also were the open cooking stations. We're kind of accustomed to seeing chefs today do the cooking, but this was a novelty back in 1983, and people really ate it up. I then go ahead and move on to talking about foods that were much more popular because they were much more affordable. So you have the Katz drugstore, which was one of the most popular places to get a soda drink or a hamburger. And it was famous with people because of the cat logo. And I find this particular photograph to be one of my favorites because it really gives you an indication of how huge the cat was. And at night, it was all lit up, glowing in the sky. And children just absolutely loved that. Katz was started by Isaac and Michael Katz. They began in 1914 in downtown Kansas City, and by the time they closed the Katz Drugstore Company in 1971, it operated in 5 states with over 50 stores. The food was cheap but consistently delicious, and while people loved the fountain treats like banana splits, they could also order the Daily Blue Plate Special. In the 1950s, I found so many advertisements for dishes like roast turkey or pot pies that sold for a whopping 59 cents. But given its visibility, Katz became the target for many sit-ins to desegregate lunch counters. And this doesn't begin in Kansas City. It begins, in my research, in 1948 in Des Moines, Iowa, when Edna Griffin and her daughter and friends were refused service at a Katz Drugs, and Griffin decided to fight back. She organized boycotts and sit-ins, and she took Katz to court on criminal and civil charges. By 1951, the St. Louis Committee of Racial Equality, which was called CORE, was targeting the St. Louis downtown Katz lunch counter, and the pressure was consistent, so that by the late 1950s, discrimination was outlawed in all 38 Katz outlets in Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Iowa. Some of the most famous of the sit-ins took place at the Katz drugstore lunch counter in Oklahoma City. That's where that picture comes from, courtesy of the Caribbean National Weekly. But a place that many people remember as maybe the most egalitarian eatery in Kansas City, where no one was discriminated against and everyone was welcome, was Sanderson's Lunch, which existed from 1914 to 1999 at 104 East 8th Street, at least for most of its life. This was an incredibly tiny little place. People sat in a horseshoe around the grill where the short order cook made everything from scratch. It was owned by William Burke Sanderson, who was a cook and who had bought Alexander's Lunch at that same location in 1914. He was a very tall man, proper-like, always in a white dress shirt with suspenders, as my dad remembered him. My dad absolutely loved the Elmer, which was a cheeseburger that was cooked and then steamed under a tent so that the meat and the cheese became so soft and the bun became very tender. But Sanderson's Lunch was also important because it served as a working person's place to get a home-cooked meal when there wasn't time to eat at home. And so it specialized in dishes like spaghetti with giant meatballs or hot chops for Popeye, which was code for breaded pork chops that were served with a mound of cooked spinach. It was a place where people ate 24 hours a day, every day of the week except for Christmas. And I think that Vanessa Coots, who was a waitress there, really summed up for me what made Sanderson special. She said, people are the same. In the end, they're all looking for some comfort, whether it be in the meatloaf and mashed potatoes, the company of stoolmates, or just a friendly place to sit for a while and let the steam from their coffee cup warm their souls. So while Kansas Cityans could depend on any number of cafeterias, diners, and burger stands to supply them with hot tamales and chilies, I turn next in my book to exploring the legacy and history of Mexican-American cuisine and its popularity in Kansas City as it left Mexican enclaves and began to introduce non-Mexican patrons to a variety of food that went far beyond chili and tamales. You're looking there at Denise Ibarra Hamilton's Sopapilla hardware that she inherited from her father, Gus, who was famous for his Red Bull Mexican restaurants. Torreon is still in operation in Overland Park, and it is near where Gus and his wife, Betty, his first wife, operated a Mexican restaurant in Overland Park. I believe it is the first Mexican restaurant that existed in Overland Park. So if you make it out to Torreon, you really are indulging in a very, very old Mexican restaurant tradition. But the one that I focus on today has to do with a success story of sorts. And it was when I was reading WHB Swing magazine, this was put out by the radio station in 1945, that I came across this review for a place called El Nopal. And it sat where Bartle Hall sits today. In other words, there's no vestiges left whatsoever of El Nopal. But thanks to social media and connections that I had, I was put in touch with Suzanne Infante Lozano, and you'll see that she's referenced there at the very end of this review. The cute child who stares around the corner at you is Suzanne. And indeed, Suzanne gave me the history of her parents' restaurant. It was started in 1930 by Ignacio and Eulalia Lala Infante, and it was designed in order to welcome people who did not have much experience with Mexican food into the restaurant. But by 1965, the construction of Southwest Traffic Way compelled the family to move. And so Lala's replaces El Nopal, just given the name of the woman who owned it. You can see there the menu that was for Lala's and which would have also been used at El Nopal. And the way it's designed today still reflects the way a lot of us experience Mexican restaurants. In other words, there's usually a combination plate. There are combination dinners, and then you have a long list of a la carte dishes. Beef tacos, cheese tacos, tamales, tostadas are still quite common. We're not looking at that and thinking anything unusual. And then the thing that makes Lala's important is she became tired of running her own restaurant. So she became what we might call a restaurant consultant. And she helped the Barrera family in Clay Como to take their floundering El Sombrero and turn it into a success story. One thing that these restaurants were popular with people for were the Kansas City tacos. And you're seeing a platter of those right there where the corn tortillas were folded around the meat. They were clipped shut. They were boiled in oil. And when they were done, they would be pried open and they would be topped with the lettuce, tomatoes, and then that cheese on top was actually Parmesan, because Italians and Mexicans often lived in the same areas, and the Italians were making cheese. And so the Mexicans decided to top their tacos with that Parmesan cheese. And you can still find those tacos around Kansas City, including at El Sombrero, as well as Manny's, which most of you probably are familiar with, down on Southwest Boulevard. Along with Mexican Americans, Italian Americans have had a larger than life impact on Kansas City's culinary heritage. One of the most missed and loved Italian restaurants was Italian Gardens. You're looking at a picture of it there. It likewise was on Baltimore in the midst of Hotel Row. And as is often, sadly, the case with so many Kansas City pieces of architecture, it gets turned into a parking lot, or in the case of Italian Gardens, into a parking garage. I thought I'd focus a little bit on another Italian restaurant that was long-standing in Kansas City called Gaetano's. Its pizza was famous in Kansas City, and it lives on today thanks to one of Ed Bruni's proteges, and his name is Gary Wilson, and that's him standing there with pizzas that are based on the recipes that the Gaetano's owner gave him shortly before he passed away. And so one thing I love about Kansas City food history is how you can find, even today, these flavors that continue on, in this case, thanks to a very dedicated apprentice. And so I urge you to go to Gary Wilson's Pizzeria at 1801 Quindaro Boulevard in Kansas City, Kansas. Tell him that I sent you and that you want to order the 18th Street Special, which will literally transport you back to the days of Gaetano's. Joining countless immigrants from Mexico and Italy and settling Kansas City were waves of Germans and Eastern Europeans and Chinese immigrants who often found a good living in the hospitality business. The New York Bakery and Delicatessen was a literal fixture at 7016 Troost Avenue, and when it closed in 2009, people mourned because it was the last remaining real kosher deli in Kansas City. So I think we're lucky today to have Meshuggah, but if you talk to old timers, they always will wax nostalgic about the multiple flavors of bagels, the smoked lox, and the cream cheese that were a staple to a Saturday morning, Sunday morning brunch. In terms of Chinese restaurants, I'd like to take you back to King Joy Lo. The restaurant was in part to raise funds for causes that were important to the Chinese Empire Reform Association. The first King Joy Lo opened in Chicago in the early 1900s, and the second King Joy Lo opened in Kansas City due to a family relation. The place was also important because Bo Sing Yang and Harry and Don Toy worked there as managers. It was very long-lived, and it existed in two different locations, both of which were on second floors above the Princess Theater in one case and above drugstores in another case. It was popular because people loved to go to the Paramount or to other theaters and take in a show and then make sure that they worked in a trip to King Joy Lo before or after the performance. The food was, for many people, their first introduction to Chinese food. It was Cantonese in its style, which means it was relatively mild, and it was designed to be tasty to Westerners. It was famous for its stir fries, and these included black and white mushrooms, bean sprouts, water chestnuts, chicken, shrimp, beef, bound together in an oyster sauce slurry, as Pat Price remembered when he published a retrospective on this restaurant in a 1999 Kansas City Star article. The restaurant suffered from some fires, including the one that ultimately closed it in 1961. And instead of reopening, Harry Toy joined his cousin Don, and they opened the House of Toy on the Country Club Plaza. So some of you might remember it. It specialized in many of the same Cantonese dishes that were popular at King Joy Low, albeit in a more modest setting. It was a plaza fixture until 1993, when the J.C. Nichols Company refused, sadly, to renew its lease. So that leaves us with the final chapter of my book, and this was the hardest one to write for reasons that I'll go into tomorrow night at my craft talk at Central Resource Public Library. But in short, how do you choose which restaurants to put in a chapter on those still with us when there are so many? So the chapter had to be very short. I was under strict word count. So I selected the very oldest continuously operating restaurants, including Dagwood's, that's been sitting there at Southwest Boulevard since 1938. I urge readers to use the last chapter of my book as a guidebook, cherish the history of the restaurants covered in Chapter 10, and try to make it a priority to visit and seek out the flavors of yesteryear, to understand something about how those flavors of yesteryear help us to understand the flavors that Kansas Cityans today still crave and oftentimes expect from restaurants today. You're looking there at several that I mentioned in that last chapter. Dixon's famous chili started in 1919. It has not altered its chili recipe since then. Also, we've got Arthur Bryant's Barbecue. It was Charlie Bryant's Barbecue, and both of the Bryants learned how to smoke meat from Henry Perry. So they're continuing a tradition that takes us back to the early part of the 20th century. We've got the Tenderloin Grill, also on Southwest Boulevard, which specializes in the pig snoot sandwich. It's probably the last remaining place where you're going to find this delicacy that was so popular, especially if you were standing outside the Reno Club and you were ordering it from a John Agnos lunch wagon. Stroud's still has the same fried chicken dinners that it's been serving since the early days in the 1930s. You've got Las Corrals. 1949 is when it opens, and it still carries the Kansas City taco, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of restaurants still with us that are long-lived, and I ask people not to take them for granted, because if we do take them for granted, they disappear. And when they disappear, we lose a significant part of our culinary heritage. I'll end with a quote that I take from my previous book on Kansas City, A Food Biography. Kansas City cuisine is ever-changing. It absorbed the traditions of those who settled here, and equally important, it reflected a lot more than the inhabitants' mere will to survive. It continues to borrow the culinary strategies of newcomers, no matter who they are. This liberal approach to food, with its combination of adventurous tastes and pragmatic adaptation to what is available, is essential to understanding Kansas City foodways. We have a little bit of time for questions, and so I'll go ahead and wrap up at this point and take your questions. Thank you so much for coming.
All right, thank you for that wonderful presentation. We do have quite a few questions in here, so let's see. First off, do you have any favorite lost iconic restaurants?
I have several. I would say that the one that stands out the most for me was probably the Italian Gardens, and that's because it was after prom, and I was very hungry, and so was my date. And this was in the 80s, and Kansas City's downtown was kind of a ghost of what it had been. But we decided to get in the car and leave the prom and drive downtown. And on a whim, I said to my date, let's go to Italian Gardens. And we went in, and it was like we entered another world. It was so different than what I was expecting. It was intimate. The waitress was so friendly. The food was delicious. And I feel really badly that the Italian Gardens had to close, that the building was razed. John David DiCapo, thank goodness, the son of Carl DiCapo, has been running Italian Gardens to go. And he's recently just sold that restaurant to somebody who's also a chef who plans to keep that pizza and some of those Italian Gardens favorites going. But the original restaurant, I truly miss. Thanks for that.
All right, to kind of go along with that, do you plan to write another book on this topic?
I don't know. I seriously don't know. I'm definitely continuing to do research in Kansas City foodways, particularly when it came to the Jim Crow era. But whether or not I have another book in me on this topic, I'm not quite sure.
Fair enough. You'll probably go into this a little bit more at your book talk tomorrow night, but can you give us a little preview? How do you go about researching for this book?
Yeah, I am going to talk about that tomorrow night in some detail. It was very difficult to figure out how to organize this book, how to put it together. Part of what I had to do was I had to figure out what I thought was going to be easy, but actually turned out to be incredibly difficult. And that was to simply find the start and end dates of a lot of restaurants that are no longer with us. And I came to realize that restaurants are sometimes they're just here. We take them for granted and then they're gone. And no one's kept records of them because so few people think that food history, or they used to think that food history was of no value. So finding artifacts like menus, newspaper articles turned out to be incredibly challenging for a lot of the restaurants. But once I did establish the start and end dates, I was able to look at those and large pick restaurants to focus on that lasted for at least half a century, if not more. And that became the first kind of organizing principle for the book. But it was a very tough book to write because the word length, the word count was so narrow. And of course, I was writing it during COVID when I had restaurants that were closing that should have been in the book, but couldn't be in the book because of the fact that it was already under production. So it was a fairly stressful process.
All right. What do you think makes a restaurant memorable?
Well, to me, a memorable restaurant is one that is known by, let's say, a family that goes back more than one generation. So maybe a grandfather and grandmother remember becoming engaged in that restaurant, like let's take the Savoy. And then their children, they celebrate their rehearsal dinner at that same restaurant. And then the next generation, they go to that restaurant again, let's say the Savoy, to celebrate the graduation of a son or a daughter from high school. And so the restaurant actually has a longevity in the family's history as well as in the city's. So that's one way that I would answer that question.
Perfect. All right. There seems to be a wide variety of ethnic foods in Kansas City restaurants. And why do you think this is?
Well, Kansas City from its origin was a crossroads. So it was a place where people came here, but they were passing through. And so a lot of the people who settled here actually found that they could make a good living in catering to those who were passing through. Well, Kansas City, given its location, was attractive to many, many different waves of immigrants because there was plentiful work. And a lot of immigrants would start working in, let's say, the meat packing industry or maybe in the milling industry. And they would find that they didn't like it, but that they could very easily find work in hospitality. And so as a result, a lot of people found opening a restaurant to be a great way to make a living. And so each wave of immigrant would oftentimes open a restaurant based on what they remembered from home. this would be definitely the case for Germans. It would be the case for Eastern Europeans, Mexican Americans, Italian Americans, Russian Americans. And then that continues all the way up to today. If you look around Kansas City, the metro area, in the nooks and crannies of various strip malls, you're just going to find so many ethnic restaurants that are the result of people that still find that to be a viable way to get a foothold, an economic foothold in the city. We see it a lot with Vietnamese restaurants in the 1970s, 1980s, and up through the settlement in Kansas City of Ethiopians, for example, people from Kenya as well as parts of South America. So Kansas City has always had a very vibrant restaurant history because it's catered to so many people passing through, and that legacy is still with us today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think that wraps up our time with you tonight. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Also, thank you to all the Johnson County Library staff who helped make this program possible. If you haven't gotten your fill of iconic restaurants in Kansas City, you can have programs with Dr. Broomfield tomorrow night as her book talk. I believe registration is closed, but call the library and we might be able to set you up if you're still interested. And the food writing workshop is on Saturday, September 17th. And there's a sign-up link for that program in the resource list on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can find it on the Johnson County Library website, jocolibrary.org. So let's see. Thank you again so much for attending our program today. Please let us know through the poll on the screen where you heard about the program so we know where to advertise in the future. Our next The Past is Prologue program will be on Tuesday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. right here on 24, and will feature artist Patty Streeper. Patty will explain her process of painting visual biographies of iconic women in history. So be sure to watch our website for more information on that. Thank you again for attending, and we'll see you at our next program.
Bye-bye, everybody.